Yesterday we had, I think, a really great day talking a lot about what consumers want and what consumer preferences are, largely in the US and developed countries. And that's, of course, a really important conversation for all of us. But one of the things we're going to try to tackle this morning is also thinking about what people need in parts of the world where they don't have a lot of choices at all, whether they're a farmer or in some cases consumers, or even have access to different kinds of markets. And we're talking about some of the developing and emerging economies of Asia and Africa, where smallholder farming, and in some cases subsistence farming, is how a lot of the farming is done. We have a couple of folks here, Rob and David, who have really distinguished careers in agriculture, but have both spent a fair bit of time in smallholder farming systems. It's hard for us to see, but I'd like to try to get a show of hands. How many people here have been on a smallholder farm in an Asian country? Okay, fair number. And how many have been on a smallholder farm in an African country, other than South Africa? Less, but a few at least. Well, maybe for those of you, you might share, I think for any of us who've spent time on those kind of farming systems, you get pretty passionate about what's possible there. Maybe it's the resiliency of the people, the potential of what could be possible. But I think right now is in a really important moment of time, as we talk about these big global challenges, population growth and all of these things, these parts of the world and these markets are going to be increasingly important, and just a great opportunity for us, but something we really need to understand a little bit better. I think folks, recognize Asia represents over 60% of the population. It's the fastest growing population, but actually between now and 2050, about half of the 2.4 billion people that are going to be joining our planet are actually going to be in Africa. They're expected to double their population growth, and actually to continue increasing even as Africa's population or Asia's population growth starts to level out. At the same time, we see a real dual challenge for these parts of the world of around malnutrition. About a third of children in some of these countries are stunted, which has devastating effects for them, for their communities, but really for all of our global community. At the same time, as some of these countries start transitioning more into a middle class, they start seeing the burden of obesity in pockets as well. And so there's been a shifting focus not just on food security, but also on nutrition security in this part of the world. And I think we're all already familiar with the kind of climatic challenges they face with water shortages and drought, the impacts climate change can cause. So there's just this really interesting time where over the next 40 years or so, we have this really daunting challenge and opportunity in agriculture and food production, and these markets are going to play a really important role in that. And so that's what we want to unpack today, because the really exciting thing is that agriculture plays such a fundamental role there, and there's a lot of potential to improve it. There's been a lot of organizations working in these markets, the governments themselves, governments from other countries including ours, big foundations like Gates Foundation, the World Bank, NGOs, private sector. Some progress has been made, but there's also some real barriers there and things you need to be mindful for. So we're lucky we have these folks who can share with us some thoughts about what would be the potential of investment and technology in this part of the world. So I'm going to start with you, Rob, and I'd like you to just build maybe a little bit on what I try to lay, because I like getting people excited about this part of the world. Why you think these markets should matter to this audience, and how they differ from U.S. markets. What do you see the risk of not focusing on this part of the world, and what do you think we can gain by doing it right?
Great. Well, Natalie, thanks, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. I left Monsanto in December. This is my first official meeting in a while, and it's been great. Love the energy, the excitement, the diversity of participants here. We've got established companies and startups and people on the ag and food and nutrition side, and it's been terrific. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to meet with a lot of old friends and make a few new ones, so that's been pretty cool. I joined Monsanto back in 1980, and back in 1980 we used to talk about all of the countries around the Pacific as being developing countries. Back then no one thought much of Brazil or South America from an agricultural perspective, and I watched that transformation and how that's changed in my career. I have exactly the same feeling today for the opportunity. And I'm going to focus largely on Africa because I think that's such a tremendous opportunity. You know, Natalie commented on some of the demographics. We're going to see a huge increase in Africa population, so the need is there. You know, it may surprise you to know that a couple of the countries, although they're growing from a small base, are the fastest growing economies in the world. And in a few years, some of the African cities will probably be the largest cities in the world. So they're going to see a trend towards urbanization unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. You know, we think about the smallholders and the opportunity. They will need the opportunity to become more efficient, to address labor issues, and I'll come back and talk about that. I think the investment opportunity, I mean, it is the investment opportunity for the future. You know, I've been to Africa multiple times. They have the soil, they have the moisture. They lack a lot of the infrastructure, and certainly in many of the countries, the political challenges are still pretty daunting. But the things that I think make the opportunity so ripe at this point in time from a long-term investment perspective is the technologies and tools that are being developed have enormous fit in Africa. We've seen that in the work that's been done on some of the large crop breeding or some of the immediate transfers of digital technology and tools. You know, and what's unique, I think, is that the technology and tools that we're developing today have a very low barrier to adoption. I always describe it this way. You can take the latest advances in biotechnology and gene editing and make a better seed, and every small farmer in Africa knows what to do with the seed. Similarly, when you think about the digital advances, it surprises a lot of people to know that over 70% of the farmers in Africa today have access to a cell phone. And it's not obviously just a cell phone, but it's the tool that connects them for the first time to information, you know, weather information, market information, information on pricing and where that comes from. And really importantly in Africa, the ability to do direct financing, both to overcome the middleman in that financing scheme, but really importantly to empower women and have access to resources and information. I view these technologies as being transformational on a global scale for agriculture, but in every example I'm familiar with, the smallholder gets disproportionate advantage from these tools because they are able to make such a huge step change. And we can talk about examples for that later. But I think when you look at it, Natalie, from both the need and the demand and the business opportunities and the discontinuities that technology can create, it is the time for Africa.
Excellent. So David, I'd like you to tell folks a little bit about your experience working in these kind of farms, but in particular, we hear a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. For those who might not be as familiar, I mean, these help guide some kind of economic policies and decisions and things for governments, NGOs, and private sector and others. And those Sustainable Development Goals focus a lot on this part of the world, and it's not all about necessarily importing food into those parts of the world, but actually revitalizing agriculture locally in those economies. So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on, are we going to potentially see that we're not exporting food to those countries? Instead, countries like ours are going to be actually exporting technologies instead, kind of building on what Rob said, and your thoughts on some of the technologies that could be most impactful.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for iSelect and the opportunity to be here today, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel in particular and bring an Australian perspective to it. What I might do is just share with you the background of how did an Australian, as a young man, end up in developing world countries. I started out my career as what's termed a jackaroo in Australia, which is an apprentice in the field of agriculture under the ownership of the Rupert Murdoch properties. And I saw a career path that was there, but I also saw that I was working in a company that was owned by someone who was playing in agriculture as opposed to being a serious participant. I had an opportunity to move on after a great 5-year career with him, but still as a young man, and start an operation in the northwest part of New South Wales, Australia. And that was all focused on a cotton development. But it had an interesting ownership to it. It was owned by the British Coal Board Pension Fund. It had been leased to a family out of Northern Ireland with a management company based in Sydney with a farming operation some 900 kilometres northwest from there. So it was an interesting communication triage to put together. And in the middle of all that, it was the same time when Arthur Scargill, the famous unionist, took on Margaret Thatcher and put Britain in a position where it had to import coal for the first time in its history. So the outcome of all that was the negotiations finalised, and there was an opportunity that all the coal board assets the pension fund had invested around the world had to be liberated out of those countries and taken back to England to create work for out-of-work miners. I'm quite sure of the sense behind that, but it gave me my greatest opportunity. We were able to raise capital from a management team perspective and arrange a float for this company in 1984. And this is well before the agricultural boom itself. And one of our challenges there was the Foreign Investment Review Board of how much country or how much equity could be held offshore. And we were limited to, we could only put 49% offshore and raise the rest onshore, which we were able to do and achieve. So stewarding and building that company from its base, our first crop of 400 acres, and I accelerate right forward 19 years later when I ultimately left the company, we ended up with a farming base of 68,000 irrigated acres of cotton, 2 cotton gins, a massive marketing company, not only marketing our product, the product that was complementary to us from other Australian farmers, a risk management marketing company based out of California where we were using the US farm programs to offset our risk with similar varieties of cotton and qualities of cotton, and a central trading hub out of Hong Kong distributing into the markets. The one thing you get in Australia all the time, and it's nearly as regular as clockwork, to be honest with you, is droughts. And they can be quite severe. They don't run for 1 year, they can run for 2, 3 and 4 years. One of the greatest assets I had building the enterprise was how to secure and keep my team together, not only keep them motivated on what we were doing, because they were the ones with the knowledge, they had the soil knowledge, the environmental knowledge, they had all the engineering knowledge, they had the social knowledge of where the workforce was, etc. And as we were moving through the technologies of changing both from equipment to the agronomics to the entomology, I wanted to keep those people in my team. When drought came upon us, and drought just doesn't arrive one morning, it sneaks up on you all the time, and you've got to be prepared for it. So part of running the enterprise, and enterprises that I run in the future, is always being aware of being prepared for drought and how to react to drought, and actually those reaction takes place a lot earlier than most people think. So we developed a small company called Agricultural Australia where I could take the expertise of the farmers, the agronomists, the entomologists, the engineers, and some of the HR team, and put out to the world market in consulting contracts. Now, in our first drought, started in 84, didn't take long to come. We arrived in 87 and went through to 89. And we profiled ourselves in front of the World Bank and a few other organisations and went about winning contracts. And some of the contracts we won were principally in Africa, both on the east and west side. And some of the more interesting ones were actually in the Sudan itself on the Gezira floodplains, which were absolutely fascinating. So we were able to take then and build a team, and when the droughts were finished, and the contracts hopefully were finishing at the same time, which they never did, but you're able to bring back your expertise and re-establish other people. And it opened up a whole horizon to ourselves where other skills were to bring back into Australia, whether it was agronomists and entomologists out of California or out of Brazil, out of Uzbekistan, etc., because all those people were applying for jobs as we put them together. So that gave me personally a great opportunity not only to see how the funding model worked in developing agricultural economies in other nations, but it also gave me a great hand to actually come up against some of the problems that Rob alluded to, especially in the political era, especially within the religious era, and then ultimately within the communities and families in which you've got to work across when you start dabbling in these areas. But there's one thing that came quite clear to me and gives me a lot of confidence when you even sit here today, is that there's a trajectory of human growth in the world, but there's also a great trajectory on our success in bringing this along, because it's not, it's really not as bad. It is bad in places, but it's not as bad as that can be envisaged across a screen or a television set. We as mankind, and especially we in the Western world, have made great contributions to the success and the developing of not only the better standards of quality, the better standards of nutrition, but the better standards of community and the quality of life as a whole. And it's with that, in essence, it's with a form of philanthropy through investment that has started to secure it. So when I look at the 17 tenements that the United Nations has set, and if you go to the first three, which are principally based around nutrition, around hunger, nutrition, and well-being, the technologies that we're talking about, and especially yesterday, they seem to be applying to a high-valued, first-world, high-quality problem, but they can easily and quickly be transferred over to other nations and other areas of the world. And as Rob said, the easiest thing you can do is put that technology in a seed and give it to those farmers, because they all know what to do with the seed, and they all know what time and how to do it. And some of the quicker advancements, which Rob alluded to there, was just the ability for subsistence farming to move beyond that into one little step that we have in the Western world, which is insurance. And through the cell phone activity, digitalisation of the telecommunications, etc., is that seed companies now can actually sell seed with a SIM phone card in the bag of seed. The farmer can register, he owns the seed when he plants the seed, and with that he can also register to determine whether he's had rain in the planting period, because he's bought insurance with that seed, and if he hasn't, he can get replacement seed for it. So just little steps like that, through technology, through the ability to monitor the weather. He doesn't have to misrepresent the weather. The weather's there every day through a satellite imaging and to determine what it is. But he gets then the opportunity, which he would never be able to afford before, to replant that seed. So through our discussion today, there will be plenty of examples of how we're progressing, but more importantly, it's the interference of our progressing. It's generally not from the will of the Western world, or generally the will of the government. It's the intervention of some other disruption in and around it. And we're seeing that at the moment, the elongated, and it is an elongated Arab Spring. You go way back to when the unsettling period started, way back in Egypt, to where it is and how it's jumped boundaries and progressed itself around the Middle East itself to where we are today. So it's the challenge beyond government. It becomes the challenge of, in effect, regimes and how we go about managing them.
So I want to build a little bit on that. The last speaker made a point that I think he said technology has never moved as slowly as it is now. It's just going to speed up. And I think this is a really important, really applicable to this part of the world. So let's take Africa, for instance. 93% of folks there have access to a cell phone. Less than 2/3 have access to piped water. So they're just fundamental needs that we've not been able to penetrate the way we really need to, despite lots and lots of years of work, that kind of infrastructure, that's held back a lot of development in that part of the world. And these digital kind of tools and technologies can really help us leapfrog some of those infrastructure challenges, and we've heard a little bit about that. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more, because a lot of our audience here have technologies that they're developing or they're investing in. Let's talk a little bit more about what kind of role technology can play, really taking advantage of this digitalization that's going on, but also what are some of the barriers or watch outs we need to keep in mind as we're trying to enter into those markets? What are some of the things that can hold it back?
Well, you're right. There's a lot going on. I really enjoyed the session yesterday afternoon with some of the startups and some of the new technologies that I hadn't focused on. So it's an unusual time. I've been involved in technology all my life, and had the chance to see the impact that some of the advanced breeding techniques and some of the new tools like biotechnology can have on farming, not only in this country, but literally around the world. When I look into the future, one of the hard things for me to always communicate to an audience is how, because there's always a tendency to kind of look at the future and draw that straight line with the points in the past. We're in a period of unusual discontinuity. Technology in agriculture has never seen the levels of capital investment and in impact. I would have thought 25 years ago that putting a new gene into a cotton or a soybean plant to change its properties relative to herbicide resistance or insect resistance was really pretty remarkable. But today, when I think about the impact of the advanced breeding techniques, the use of gene editing, where now you literally have the ability not only to improve and modify every single gene in a crop, but literally every base pair in that gene. I mean, it's unbelievable to already see the implications that this technology has had for redesigning photosynthesis and yields, for altering nutrition, disease resistance, shelf life. I mean, truly transformational tools. But the point that I want to build on is when we built the first biotechnology crops, it was investments of literally hundreds of millions of dollars. When the human genome was first sequenced, it was nearly $1 billion. Today, you can sequence enough genes in a plant for $100 to be able to do mapping. The important point of these tools, which I think gets to the heart of why I'm so optimistic for the future, is that the discontinuity here is the price point has enabled broad access to all of the world's crops. One of my favorite people at Mars is Dr. Shapiro, who's made his life's mission to sequence the genomes of all of the smallholder crops in the world. He's completed that. The ability now to use these tools to take local varieties and impart the yield and disease and other improvements in nutrition and quality is enormous. The opportunities with the digital tools are the same. They transcend borders, they transcend a lot of the politics and a lot of the historical issues. And the beauty of that technology is we're already seeing lots of startup companies across Africa that are working on drone technology or working on marketing programs and communication programs. We did a pilot project a few years ago in India with just using text messages where we're able to access 4 million smallholder farmers with weather information and agronomic advice. And those kind of tools are being replicated around the world. So it's a transformation occurring in terms of not only technology access and impact, but the affordability and really the democratization of technology that can fit. Now, I just need to highlight the other part of it. There's probably few people that have seen the impact of technology in agriculture, through the lens that our company has, but also the challenges of not having a supported public or a communication effort or a regulatory support for these technologies. And I still see in Africa today that many of the biggest obstacles aren't the willingness of farmers to adopt technology, the ability of these new tools to have an impact, but it really becomes the political and regulatory will to move these technologies into the marketplace. And so I think, I always, have concluded, as the R&D guy, that it takes, great science to create products that can create value. What I've learned is it also takes incredible communication and commitment to earning the public trust to ensure that those technologies can reach the market. And I think that's true here in the US, it's certainly true in Europe, but it's equally true in Africa. So I would flag those as the incredible opportunity for technology to have an impact, but the clear focus that also needs to be placed on building the communication, the trust, and the efforts to ensure that there's outreach to the public and the decision makers that are responsible for approvals.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, one of the things I think we should recognize is that for, 2 decades, I think, there were efforts within different universities and to take scientists from some of these countries and train them and give them exposure to what's happening in other parts of the world, and those folks are going back. It took a long time to build up a base of folks who could be local experts, that could be vocal, and really trying to help energize them now is going to be, or empower them now is going to be important, but that's an important base that we can work
And I think it's also, as you know, just over the last 2 decades, the tools of communication have changed so dramatically in how people get their information. I mean, I used to write, and publish papers and write articles, and today, if you just look at the U.S., but it's rapidly looking like this around the world. We get about 10% of our information via television. We get about 10% of our information in printed media. 80% comes from social media and the internet, and so I basically say if you're not on Twitter or Facebook or participating in YouTube videos, you're really not communicating. And so that's been a lesson for our industry to learn, and it's increasingly the point around the world.
Okay, David, I'd like you to build on this because I know that we talk a lot about the use of technology in the field, but it's also really important to think about post-harvest some of the opportunities and needs. We hear a lot about it's about producing more food. It's also about wasting less food, and there's some real challenges with that in post-harvest situations, being able to really get things to market. So can you talk a little bit about some of those kind of technologies and the value, and the same thing, your advice for companies and organizations that might want to bring technologies there, things they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to lead up to get there and to swing off the back of Rob's comments, if you take technology from my studies, and I look at what have been the great breakthroughs. You can go back in time to the pharaohs where they messed around with irrigation and were able to change things. But if I start way back in 1909, when Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch worked out how to synthesize available nitrogen to plant through ammonia, through the development of the ammonium products that we know today, and just that step in itself, what it did to agriculture. Then if you go into the Golden Grain Project with the rice, and what that was able to achieve, not only with the yield of rice, but with the qualities of rice and the nutrition of rice. But at the same time, it's still being politicised today in and around parts of China. If I take the next quantum step, and I put this in one word, which was the next quantum self in itself, because it did so much, this one word. And that one word is Monsanto itself. It created the runway, used the runway, and delivered a lot of the technologies where we are today. Now, if I was to look at all the technologies that are on the table today and say, which is the next one of the future, I'd find it nearly impossible. Because I think we're going through the very similar to the internet startup phase, the development of Microsoft and others, that a lot of the products we see out there today, how are they going to be used? And they will be used, merged into someone else's chain, ultimately to deliver a solution. But they will be merged in an environment that Rob just highlighted there, that these issues now are seriously socialised. Anything from the great discovery, or the great ability through CRISPR to be able to deliver both plant and animal genetic editing, right down to some of the practices that we have. So when I look at it, I don't think our challenge is going to be delivering food. Our challenge will be delivering quality food. But then when we deliver the quality food, getting down to your question, is how do we make it available to the ultimate end user, the constituents within those countries? And one of the things that's quite obvious today, and especially when I go in and out of India in particular, it's just the vast, vast quantities of food that is produced, but is actually wasted at the same time. And I remember my early days in the former Soviet Union in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and in Tashkent and around some of the larger areas. Everything was driven on a daily fresh market. What was purchased in the morning was consumed that evening, and either the housewife or the housemaid went out and brought the product back, and any other product was either consumed back into the animal chain or just wasted. Now, a lot of that has to do with just where those countries are with the infrastructure of electricity, the ability to buy refrigeration, understand storage itself, and just how the food chain works in that last literally half mile, not mile, to get it to the consumer itself. And a lot has to do, and especially our major neighbour in Australia to the north, which is Indonesia. It's the largest Muslim population in the world. And under Sharia law, is what gets harvested on that day, whether it be animal protein or food protein, must be consumed in that day. So when you look at food itself, it's meeting the challenge of the post-harvest delivery into the food chain and to get it there. So it's just not an industrial change that we need or we're challenged with. It's also a area of faith that looks at food and how it's being consumed that needs to be addressed at the same time. So we've got some, when you arrive, it's just not as easy as I'm here to be a saviour, or I'm here to be a participant, or I'm here to help. There is a lot of aspects that you need to show pretty serious respect around to achieve your goals, because you can intimidate and inflict quite personal embarrassment upon yourself and others if you want to start challenging the food chain and why they've got that food chain there.
Yeah, it's an important point. Well, I have some more questions, but I think we're going to try to open it up to the audience. So I hope folks get a sense, if you're working on technology that has application in the field or technologies that have some of these post-harvest opportunities, this could be a pretty interesting part of the world to be looking at. So we'll open up to questions from the audience. I'm relying on the people with the microphones because it's really hard to see.
We got it.
I do have sunglasses here if you'd like.
You almost need
We got
them.
one over here.
Sure, right up here in front.
We got this woman first, and then the one in the front.
Well, a lot of our experience has been. Let me repeat the question. So the question is from an individual who's spent time in developing countries looking at the revenue model. I mean, our revenue model has been pretty simple in terms of selling seeds, and in that case, the trick is obviously to get the distribution and the costs such that you can manage on a small incremental value from the grower, and demonstrate technology that works and drives the that desire. So whether it's a cotton seed that's protected with against insects or things like that, we've worked through distribution systems that enable us to do that. And I think one of the important things that we've seen, particularly in Africa, is the importance of partnerships and working and not adding additional cost and reducing the duplication in distribution. So when we're looking for distribution of seeds to smallholder farmers, we've worked with a number of local African retailers to make that happen and make the system work. So from the seed side, smallholders, we can create value at that front, and that's successful. On the digital side, our models are just being developed, and I would say that in general, those are not yet generating the kind of profit that we'll need in the future. But as they become more adopted and scale, I think there's promise there as well.
I think fundamental to the revenue model at all levels, whether it's at the top end of the corporates in the world, or right down to the small market in the developing world, is the notion of profit. They're all in there to develop profit, and that form of exchange takes place either in cash or kind at the base level. Sometimes it's at the higher level. It takes form in the form of being secured by end product, a lien over the products itself, or right down to being secured by government funding or aid funding that makes sure that the international presence can get in there and give the opportunity of the technology, but protect the revenue models that are there. But profit at the end of the day was really what drives the revenue models right across the board.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I do think that some of these different kinds of players, like governments and foundations and others that are trying to stimulate agricultural development there, see the private sector as a really important partner and are looking for ways that they can help make investment there bigger. Any other questions? One back there?
Yep. Hi, thank you. Wanted to know if you could speak a bit more about the delineation between using widespread technology across the board versus really being localized, since farming is so localized, and just we're talking about smallholders in Africa and Asia. This Africa, that's 54 nations alone. Asia, we're talking about probably the largest two populations, broadest ecosystem, just such diversity. So I think the strength, and you've both hit on it through this, is being able to really kind of jump the curve and maybe bypass some of the challenges we had in North America and Europe. And it looks like part of that is knowing when we can have these widespread adoption of these low-hanging fruits that are absolutely there and we see, versus knowing when to jump in and have those localized solutions. So if you have any thoughts, that would be great.
I think it's really a blend. I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but probably the most important food crop in Central Africa is maize. It's used for animal feed, it's used for porridge, it's used for, one of the most important cash crops is cotton. And so there are examples where technology has almost immediate transferability and economic benefit, and as I mentioned when I talked earlier, the benefits can be disproportionate. If you look back at the history of the introduction of insect-protected cotton in the U.S., farmers in the U.S. saw better yields and better economics and less expense on insecticides, and on average gained about a 7% increase in profitability. If you take that same technology to India or to Africa, where they don't have access to sprayers or insect control, farmers have seen doublings of yield, so that the impact can be disproportionate. I think it's similarly true on the digital side, where farmers that never had access to accurate weather information, agronomic practices, local market pricing, et cetera, now are connected. The impact and the improvement in decision making can be enormous. But the other aspect is what I tried to get into. These tools and all that information on making better decisions are just as applicable to growing a larger acre crop as they are a cassava and a millet that's uniquely adapted. And now with the advent of literally low-cost markers and gene editing tools, people today are working in their laboratories on improving, the yields and disease resistance of the orphan crops as well. And so I think it's a win-win from both dimensions.
In a lead up to that, back in the late 80s, one of our projects that we took on, which I referenced earlier, was the establishment of boundaries and the establishment of land title, and which we were able to do, which all thanks to the first Gulf War, when we got the ability to use GPS navigation to actually win some contracts both in the Sudan and in the former Soviet Union, and go in and identify where land titles were. And it was interesting. We could take the discussion amongst the villages and where their land was, then actually go and plot it, take it back to them and get agreement. And once we got agreement with it, we are actually created then a land title in its own right. And then that land title became a security that got traded. Once those securities got traded from 4, in Sudan they were using a measurement called a fadan, from 4 fadan, and now when you go back there, they're like 30 and 40 fadans. And that little bit of GPS technology allowed us to get to there. But that same GPS technology now, as it's gone through its improvement and innovation curve, supports the seed technologies and the applications that are there. Is that They can be identified exactly where these seeds have been grown, not only to identify the use of them, but also the protection of them if anything goes wrong with them. And there's a serious breakdown in the technology itself. You can go back and plot and identify where those areas are and work on them pretty quickly. So technology is rapidly moving through all the developing world. As we develop our satellite base and then we complement it with our solar-powered receiving devices on the ground, the curve is moving at an exponential speed of progress.
Excellent. Another question?
Yeah, one back here.
Does this work? Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Mark Toller, I have a couple of comments, and it's so fascinating to see that so many people have an awareness of what's going on in Africa. But I wanted to kind of point out, having spent a lot of time and lived in Sudan and South Sudan and Uganda, that part of Africa, for a good portion of the past 15 years, a lot of us are thinking that technology is something that can be inserted, something that you can give these particular groups of people, farmers, social groups, whatever. And in a lot of parts of Africa, technology is not necessarily what they're looking for. Technology is a tool that needs to be used for the build-out of infrastructure. A lot of these places don't even have a bridge. There are no paved roads. So what I'm encouraging all of us to think about, and this is one reason I'm here today, is to see how our respective networks and capabilities can be used to further expand the general supply chain, the general business model that includes food and agriculture. But in this case, it's going to include refrigeration, it's going to include warehousing, it's going to include electricity. None of these things are there. It's going to include water. The Nile goes right through these two countries, and you would not believe how dusty the landscape is just a few hundred yards from the Nile in so many regions. And they don't plant because there's no pump, because there's no power, because there's nothing. And this part of Africa used to be the breadbasket of the entire continent. Sudan and South Sudan, plagued by war, but in the past, they grew so much. So I wanted to just remind and ask the panel to comment on this reflection I've made about technology not as something to be inserted, but something to be used for infrastructure build-out. And also, just in general, these two countries, Sudan and South Sudan, right now are at a crossroads. And also, although we're talking about global food security, meaning enough food for people to eat, in this part of Africa, the nature of the food industry could be what stabilizes these countries so that they stop warring, they stop fighting. There's a war going on right now in South Sudan, and we all know President Bashir was just kicked out of office just a month ago, and there's only a transitional government in Sudan. So this is an opportunity for close to $1 trillion of investment over the next 10 or 15 years. China's going to do it with or without us. We should consider finding a way to get involved, not just by parachuting in and helping with a particular technology, but let's think about a broader way to get involved, because I firmly believe that this is a critical region of Africa, and it's a fantastic opportunity. Could you please comment on those thoughts? Thanks.
I might lead on that, Rob, and then pass over to yourself. First of all, you're quite right, especially South Sudan. It is what I would describe as a nasty part of the world to go to, a frightening part of the world to go to, and a frightening observation of humanity being played out at the moment. How do we get there? It's really you're up against regimes. You're not against. You're up against despots in a lot of places, and therefore you need a lot of resources. And therefore, when you're going in to manage that with, especially with human resources, you need to be able to resource those people with the right protection around them. And I suppose you've got to really make it appealing to Western world governments that want to go there and do it. So we can call upon the emotional cry for help, or we can call or promote the commercial side of the opportunity that's there. And at the moment, when you look at what the developing world's doing, they're actually not paying attention to it, even though the crisis, and it is crisis there in the Sudan's there. So it's what can we do at the political level or within our own democracies to create that interest and apply it. We've been able to do it in other parts of the world. You know, I sit back and just reflect on the rebuilding of post-World War II, the rebuilding of South Korea, the rebuilding of Vietnam. We've been able to do that. Ultimately, we will end up rebuilding the Middle East and Syria in particular. But here we are today, where it's really off the social conscience radar in its own right. And how do we get it there? That is the single biggest challenge, because we've got all the tools to put it on the social conscience radar, but it's just not getting there. And I think it's not getting there because of the size of the challenge that's in front. It literally is going to take the military engagement, military support to be able to break it down and start rolling out the technologies. Rob, have you got a view on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone who's been to Africa appreciates your comments, and you know and depending on the country and the political and the infrastructural challenges, they can be daunting. On the other hand, there are great examples of taking integrated approaches to infrastructure. The millennial village work and being able to bring the tools together can have enormous impact. And I think the cause for optimism is that these tools can be transformational when appropriately used and integrated and delivered to smallholders. And for me, that's one of the bright spots on the horizon. As I said at the beginning, the need in Africa will be enormous, and the solution set is coming both from a technology, from a country infrastructural investment, and hopefully from some of the points you made in terms of recognition of the importance to address some of the political and social problems.
Well, I think we're out of time. Is that right? Yep, everyone's nodding vehemently. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists. And keep your eye on that part of the world.